So, yeah, this talk is a kind of story about going about how to design the right product for your customer. And this is a cautionary tale. Some of you may remember in the 80s the Sinclair C5, which was a great bit of design and really ahead of its time in terms of a sustainable form of transport. But it's now a museum piece, and the reason for that is there was lots of kind of issues why people didn't really want to use the Sinclair C5. It was very low, quite dangerous. People felt they looked stupid in it. So I think, although it was a great piece of design, there was a big lesson to be learnt there about how to develop and launch a product. And for me personally, back in 2002, I was working at a digital agency near Cambridge. And we used to do a lot of mobile development. And at that time, if you had a mobile phone at that time, you'll know that the connection speeds were absolutely appalling. And we were trying to design a search for, like a second-hand car search for a company in England. And we thought we had a fantastic product. We thought it was really exciting. It was all based geolocation. It was quite new at the time. And so we developed this WAP application at the time. Spent lots of time designing. I designed lots of wireframes and flows and really exciting stuff. We tested it a lot internally, and then we launched it, and it was a complete flop. And we might as well have developed one of these. So this is, in England, we have this saying that something's as much use as a chocolate teapot. And actually, the real problem with our particular approach to that project was we made lots and lots of assumptions, so we didn't know anything about the customers using the product except what our client told us, and we took that as the truth. And we also didn't go out and validate any of the assumptions that we had about how people might use this thing. We just kind of had ideas in our heads about how it would work. And most importantly, we didn't learn anything about our customers, our clients' customers, and how they might use this or how they already went about searching for second-hand cars. And unfortunately, there's a lot of other stories about products or startups that have failed because they haven't taken the right approach with talking to or understanding their customer needs. So I just randomly found this one through doing a Google search for startups that have failed. And this was a company that was doing cloud-based software for developers. And what they were saying in their kind of lessons learned blog when they closed the company down was they were very honest, and they said that the mistake they made was that they focused far too much on the actual kind of technical development, and they didn't take the time to go out and understand whether they were building something that would work for their customers, or even if they had some customers in the first place. So this is a really key concept that I think's been more talked about recently with Lean Startup, which I'll get onto. And Google Ventures is I guess, a kind of consulting company within Google. They go out and use design thinking and the kind of Lean Startup approach with various different startups. And Braden Carrots, who works for Google Ventures, has got a great blog post. The link's just down in the bottom there. But basically, he says the amount of times that he goes out and talks to startup founders about whether they've actually understood what it is their customers need and what problems they're trying to solve for their customers. And he says, quite often they're embarrassed to admit that they haven't actually spoken to a customer for months, and they're just too busy developing the product and designing the product without knowing whether it's actually going to solve the customer's problem. And I think this is a real trait, and I know I've been very guilty of this in the past, that it's very easy to design software products that have way too many features. You get really excited thinking, oh, well, this would be really cool if we could do this, and this would, and then we could kind of expand it and do something even better. And actually, in reality, your users will only use a handful of the features in your product. And I think, if you look at some of the bloated software, and I won't name any names, but a particular sort of large company that makes desktop products, over the years they've got very bloated, and they've learned that scaling back. So the reason Google, I think, has been so successful is they've scaled right back, and the functionality is just what people need to use. And there's actually some research to back this up. So the Standish Group, they basically gather lots and lots of data and do some analysis on this type of thing. And what they've found is that actually, in general, about 20% of features in software, and only 20% ever get used, which is quite a shocking amount. If you think how much effort and how much time your teams put into developing your software, to think that only 20% of that is actually useful to your customers. And they use the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle, and they say there's no doubt that focusing on 20% of the features that give 80% of the value will kind of maximize your investment in the software. So from that kind of thinking, there's various different methodologies and approaches to designing and developing software, which I've been learning about over the years and trying to incorporate into the way that I work. So firstly, a few years ago, probably about 8 years ago now, I was working in local government. And at the time, I did some training in Lean. And the thing that I guess really struck me about that was, firstly, this concept of only delivering things that have value to your customers. And the second thing was this idea of Kaizen, or continuous improvement. The Toyota production system kind of approach to things is an approach that in my last company, Redgate Software, we took very seriously. And in fact, we used to have Toyota consulting within the company because we saw so much value for the products we were working on. And again, the principles of the Agile Manifesto, I started working in an Agile way back in 2008. And the first principle up there, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Now, I think in this case, actually, the customer was the client, but I think it's still a useful principle if you think about the customer being the end user of the software. So beyond that, I then got interested in some of the things that Steve Blank was saying. And Steve Blank wrote the Startup Owner's Manual with Bob Dorff. I don't know if any of you read that, but it's a really useful book, particularly for product managers like yourself at the front. And one of the interesting things that he said in the book, which is so sort of common sense, you think, well, actually, this is so obvious, but he said it's really important that the whole team gets out of the building, so don't kind of sit around waiting for facts to emerge within your building. You've got to get out there and actually listen to your customers. And taking that a step further, I guess, was Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup. And this was a book that, in my last company, when it came out, our chief executive bought 150 copies. It went completely viral in our company. And we were all encouraged to read it. And we actually had Eric come over and talk to us in 2011 or 12, I think it was. And really, this is more about kind of product development than user experience. But what Eric was saying was the real thing here is not can you build a product? Have you got the kind of the ideas and the skills? It's whether you actually should be building it. So does it have a use and a value to your customer? So the principles of Lean Startup are really about kind of eliminating uncertainty. There's this idea of developing a minimum viable product, which is really something that's enough to give you evidence that it will bring value to your customers. And I think the thing to remember here is by saying minimum viable product, it doesn't mean the smallest amount of work you can do that isn't very good, but kind of actually gets a reaction from your customers. I've made that mistake before. So when I worked in Redgate, we were developing a product for Oracle developers, a source control product. And one of the kind of issues we were developing a beta product, and we were I guess it was probably more alpha than beta actually, and we had a list of people that we were in regular contact with, and we kept shipping releases very, very frequently and getting feedback from them. And what we found on a couple of occasions, we just released something too fast and it wasn't good enough, and people were very honest and came back to us and said, hey guys, this isn't up to your usual standard, it's not good enough. So we learned a lesson there. But Eric talks about this concept of validated learning, and there's a kind of a cycle in this, and it's really about kind of building a thing, and it doesn't have to be an actual piece of code. It could just be a prototype. It could even just be a website that people go and kind of sign up for a product that doesn't yet exist, just to see their interest. I'm not sure I totally agree that that's a great thing to do, because I think as a user, if you sign up for something, you kind of expect to be able to use that thing. But the idea of kind of constantly measuring how people are using a product and what feedback you're getting from them, and then iterating it and iterating the direction it's going in. So although there's this concept of validated learning, it's a bit of jargon really, and I guess the thing that really means is, does the thing that you're building solve a problem for your customers or your end users? And that's the key thing really. So after the lean startup thing had sort of blown up and we all got very excited about it, the next thing that I came across was this guy called Jeff Gottelf. Now Jeff is a user experience designer. He's based out in the States, and he was working for a company called The Ladders. And Jeff is the person who coined the term lean UX. And I remember when there was a lot of sort of talk about lean UX, and some people in the user experience community were quite unhappy about it because they thought it sounded exactly like what UX people have been doing for years and years, which is designing kind of sketches and prototyping things and going out and testing them with users. But I think it was slightly different, because it is this concept of basically coming up with a hypothesis and going out and testing that hypothesis, the idea of experimentation. And the key thing for me about Jeff Gottelf is, which I think is really great, is he talks about requirements as being assumptions. So whenever you're writing requirements, or most probably user stories in the case of most people here, you don't know for sure that these are things that your customers actually want until you've validated it. So just remember that when you're writing user stories, that they're generally assumptions up to the point where you've actually got some kind of feedback or signal from your users that's actually a need they have. And usually there's a variety of ways you can do that, which I'll cover a bit later, to find out what people's needs are. So some of the principles of lean UX, it's kind of one of these things a bit like Agile. It's just a sort of a philosophy, a way of working. There's no kind of hard and fast method. But the idea of having cross-functional teams, this idea of continuous discovery, so your whole team going out and finding out about your customer, that's a kind of really key thing. And one of the great things I think about lean UX is it's about the whole team actually owning the user experience of the product. It's not just up to your user experience designer. The whole team can go out and do user research, and you can all learn about your customers and then analyze all of that together and build a better product. So having a shared understanding about what kind of things your end users need and how they're using your product is really important. So this is a very similar looking picture really to the lean startup one, but slightly different, more aligned with a kind of a traditional UX process. And I'm going to take you through some methods that as user experience people we use within the kind of lean UX environment. But firstly, I just wanted to give you an idea of how this kind of thing works in practice and talk about a couple of case studies. So the first case study is actually back when Eric Ries came and talked to our company. He put on a video which was about a company called Nordstrom. Nordstrom are a big retailer in the US. They basically had set up an innovation team to look at areas of where they could kind of use digital products to improve their customer experience. And what they did was really, really interesting. So rather than sit in their office developing some kind of exciting new digital product for their customers, what they did was they took all of their computers and they went into one of the Nordstrom stores. So it's like a big department store. And they went into the store and they set up right in the ground floor, and they had their Kanban board and they had all their desks and their computers, and they were doing design work and coding. And they were basically developing prototypes for an app which customers could use to help them choose sunglasses. So because they had the customers just over there looking at sunglasses, as soon as they had a new design on paper, like a paper prototype, or they had later on a more developed version on the iPad, they could actually just walk straight over and test it with customers, get immediate feedback and come back and integrate those iterations into their Kanban board. So just a really kind of responsive way of working. Myself and some of my colleagues at Redgate were really, really inspired by this idea and this case study. And we were thinking, well, our customers are developers, they're very geographically dispersed. How can we possibly do something? You know, we can't go and see them, they don't all come to one place where we can go and see them. And then we thought, well, hang on, they go to conferences, they do gather in one place. We had a big conference coming up, which was the biggest Oracle developer conference. So we went along and we turned our stand into basically a design and development kind of stand. So all of the other people who were at the conference had your fairly traditional kind of stands where they were doing demos of their products. And what we did is we, over on the left here, this is where I did user research. So this is where I would get people in to talk about their process. It was actually a tool for source controlling your databases, your Oracle databases. So I talked to them about how their team used source control, what kind of processes they had in the team, what kind of problems they had source controlling their database, and in fact whether they even did source control their database, which in most cases was the answer, that basically people hadn't got a tool that would help them. So we did user research over here, in this bit. And over on this side, I was using paper prototypes to start with. And over on this side, my colleague, David, was coding up using Twitter Bootstrap a very quick prototype of how this tool might look. And our customers could see the code on the big plasma screen here as he was kind of coding it up. And it attracted a lot of interest. We even burned a Scrum board into the design of the stand, so we had that kind of as well to be, while we were at the conference, we had basically every time people went into a talk, we would then have a stand-up, you know, how are things going, what are we going to kind of work on next? And then when they came back out into the exhibition hall, we would do more user research. So it was a really exciting time, and in keeping with the kind of the lean UX or lean startup philosophy, we had a hypothesis. So this idea of experimentation, what is it you're trying to validate? So we thought that Oracle developers and DBAs needed a better way to source control their database, but we didn't know that for sure. That was just an assumption we had. So we decided that if we got more than 70% interest in this idea, that we could develop a product. So we did a number of sessions. So this is an example of one of the sessions I ran with some of the people at the conference. And they were just sitting down. I put a paper prototype of the tool in front of them. So it was kind of like, so I think this is something that you might hear more about in the next talk if you come to. But basically, we had a sketch of each different screen, and I would put it in front of them and kind of ask them, you know, how would you use this? And we talked through the process, and I got lots of really, really useful feedback. And at the end of each session, we rather cheekily kind of asked people to fill in one of these little cards, and this was to validate our hypothesis. And I know that people's intention to purchase something is kind of different from whether they will actually purchase it, but it did give us enough of a kind of signal from our users that this was going to be a useful tool from them. And we learnt so much, and this was in 2.5 days, we basically went from having some very rough ideas about the product to having quite a kind of, good idea of what the product was going to do, what kind of features it would need to go to be in a sort of first version. And we collected all the feedback on the wall. We had loads of post-it notes, so collected information about what source control systems people were using, lots and lots of feedback about things, sort of problems they had and things that would be useful to them. And all of this went into the design of the product. And we had people returning throughout the conference to come and see what kind of things other people had asked for or were, so basically we would talk about their process, I would observe them using the prototype, and people were interested to come back and see whether the things that they'd found a problem were the same for other people. And so as I said, we had an HTML, CSS prototype by the end of the conference, and we were able to take that back and turn that into a real tool. And we did lots of regular releases. So after that, we continued to get feedback from our customers all the time to feed into the product. And we quite often had sort of very small assumptions. So going back to this idea that requirements are assumptions, we did continual validation, so things like interviews, surveys, usability testing. We did a lot of remote usability testing where we were calling people up, asking them to use the product and observing them use it. And we learned loads of really interesting things from that we could build into the product. So by the time we launched our first version, it wasn't a surprise, the reaction to it or kind of the feedback we got, because we'd already been getting feedback for the last few months. And the product was a success because we'd been engaging people all the way through the process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that you can use in your teams and practically how you can go about this. So firstly, the first stage of this is I guess, doing some kind of research, understanding what kind of problems you're trying to solve for your users. So the first thing I'd say is before you even get to that stage, have some kind of plan. Have a kind of quick one-page plan that describes what problems you think you're trying to solve, what kind of assumptions you have and how you're going to test them. And there's a few different examples of this. There's the business model canvas, there's the lean canvas, and there's the experience canvas. They're all broadly similar, but they're great tools. You can kind of fill one of these in really quickly with your team in probably about an hour or 2 hours, stick it up on the wall, and then you can keep going back to it and seeing, it's just a way of sort of everyone understanding, what kind of problem are we trying to solve here? So it's a real easy way to understand why you're doing this, who you're building this thing for, and how you'll know if you succeeded. So the second thing that I do before you go out and do any kind of user research is just stating what your assumptions are. I think it's really easy to not have this mindset of thinking about things as assumptions and thinking that you already know what it is people need. So think about your user stories. Think which of these are assumptions, which do we actually know to be true, and which ones are just an assumption. Which ones are high risk, because those are the ones you want to go out and test early and find out if they're going to be a problem. So this is just an example of something I've done on a current project I'm working on at the university. We're working on quite a difficult problem, which is to do with how academics get published. And we're basically, there's a change in the government policy, which means that academics now have to publish their papers in a way so that they're open access, they're freely available. And this is a sort of a completely turning the publishing industry on its head. So I've written down a whole bunch of assumptions and indicated which ones are highest risk to us. So for example, if academics don't know which version of their published paper that they need to give us, because actually we don't want the final version to comply with the policy, we want an earlier version. If they don't know which version, then we've really failed. That's a really important thing that we need to go out and test with our users. So once you've kind of figured out what assumptions you have, what things you need to go out and test, and to learn about, you can go out and do some user research. And this is really about kind of understanding exactly how people might use your product in a real context. And as I said earlier, it's really important to try and involve the whole team in user research. I think it can be problematic if you just have one person who you designate as a kind of usability or user experience person, and they go out for a few weeks and they disappear out the office, they do some research, and they come back and present it to you, but it's very hard to understand. If you actually go out and observe firsthand, or perhaps you do some remote usability testing. So in Redgate, we used to phone up our customers, share our screen with them, watch how they used a product, or even just a clickable prototype that I'd made in PowerPoint. And the whole team would be sat around the table watching this and listening to what the customer was saying. And it's invaluable to have everyone understanding what kind of problems people face. So the key thing is to kind of observe. You can do various different ways you can do this kind of research. Observation, so you can go out and you can interview people, see where they work, understand kind of what, if it's a product like for an end consumer, maybe, go to a place where they would be using that product and try and understand the context in which they'll be using it. You can also do things like guerrilla usability tests. So the project I'm currently working on, we did some designs, some concept sketches, and we put our backpacks on and we went straight out to a load of canteens or cafes in the university, and we just sat down with people and said, do you mind if we spend 5 minutes? We just want to show you something we're working on and see if we can, see if this thing would be useful to you. And that was, it takes some guts to go out there and just sit down or try and, grab someone as they're walking past. But once you've done it a couple of times, it's a lot easier than you imagine, and it's actually quite good fun. So I really recommend trying that because you learn an awful lot. Another good source of information is product forums or beta lists. So actually, if you get into a dialogue with your customers, sometimes there's some really useful information to be had there. And also don't forget things like your help desk or call center. If you've got like a support center for your products, that's also talking to the people that talk to your customers every single day. That they're a really, really useful source of feedback. Don't just think of them as your support team, who just constantly moaning at you to get you, things fixed in the product. They're actually a brilliant source of information. So Kenneth Bowles, who's a user experience designer in the UK, talks about the importance of understanding the context in which people use your products. So this idea of getting out of the building is quite critical because you can't sort of think about, say, someone using a mobile app just, in your office, at your desk. It just doesn't help. You don't understand the different tasks that someone might be doing. They might be having different kind of conflicting demands on their attention. So you really do need to go out and observe people in context and think about how and where people will be using an application you might be developing, or perhaps who they're with as well. So people don't always use websites or applications on their own. They're quite often using them with other people. But there's something you need to be aware of when you do any kind of user research, and that's asking people what they want or what they would do. So the reason that this is important is there's been several behavioural research studies done over the years, and Margaret Mead, who was a very famous anthropologist, said that what people say and what they do are entirely different things, and there's lots of studies that back this up. People's intention to do something, what they say they'll do, is quite often very different to what they actually do. So you might have some experience of this yourself if you think about, if you go in to see your doctor and they ask how many units of alcohol do you drink each week, sometimes you're not entirely honest about that. Anyway, so that's just something to bear in mind. And I think the kind of key thing there is to avoid these sort of questions. So apologies to the product manager in the room, but I this is something that I have tried so hard to get across to product managers, that you can't just ask people what features they would want, because you know, it's like asking someone if they want the moon on a stick. They'll go, sure, you know, that sounds great. Yeah, I'd love that. It's brilliant. Yeah, okay, we'll go build that. But actually what you need to do is really understand if that thing is going to solve a particular problem they have. And the best way to do that is by observing them and interviewing them. So those are some of the questions that you want to avoid. So things like, how would you like this to work? Don't ask your customers to design the product for you. That's really not a good idea. So the kind of questions that you could ask, try and get people to talk about a particular situation. So if you're interviewing them, for example, tell me about the last time you did whatever it is. And usually that will elicit a much more realistic, kind of interesting story about a problem that they had. And quite often you can sort of probe into that. So ask them, okay, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that, or what went well, or what didn't go so well, and what happened? Why was that? Those kind of questions are the sort of things you want to be asking your users. So to get a shared understanding of user needs, one of the things that I really like to do with any team that I'm working with is that we analyse the results from any research we do collaboratively. And the way we do that is we basically, if we've been out doing user tests or we've been doing interviews for example, during the user tests I did at Redgate, while we were doing the usability test, everybody in the room had some Post-its and a Sharpie, and they were writing things that they observed on the Post-its. And at the end of those sessions, we would spend maybe half an hour getting together around a big whiteboard, and we would just put all of those Post-its on the whiteboard, and then we would group them all together in areas that kind of were related. And that was a really helpful way for everybody to understand the feedback really quickly. I didn't have to write a big report for them or anything like that. And we could also discuss at the same time why we thought these things were a problem and how we might solve them. So the other thing that you can do in a kind of lean UX world is to, you might have come across personas. Has anyone had someone in their team create personas before? Is that a familiar thing? Okay, a couple of people. So personas are really archetypes of behaviours. They don't represent real customers. They are basically a design tool, so they help you understand groups of behaviours that you've observed in people that you do research with. And then you can design for those behaviours. And they're just a way to make those behaviours kind of seem more personable and more realistic. So they're a design tool. But you can mock up some very quick ones like this, which just tell you things like people's pain points and kind of problems that they have. So the next stage in a kind of lean UX cycle, once you've done some research, is the kind of making things. So you're making something you're going to go out and test to validate assumptions you have about the customer. So this kind of idea of prototyping, there's lots of different ways you can prototype. Again, it doesn't have to be real code. So one of the things I like to do is a design studio. And that's when you get the whole team together again. And it doesn't matter if people can't draw, can't sketch, because everybody can draw boxes and circles and scribble. And we get some pens and paper, and we just have, we spend sort of, I don't know, an hour drawing. We might spend 5 or 10 minutes drawing some ideas for how different screens might look, or different kind of flows of how someone might use part of an application or a product. And then we put all of those ideas up on the wall, and we all look at them together and decide which ones we think are good and which are bad. And very quickly we can come to some good ideas. And I've found that even though I do design work, that quite often some of the developers that I've worked with have come up with some really great ideas. And everybody can have design ideas. You don't have to be designated as a UX designer to have good ideas. So the other thing is that it's very quick and easy to create these kind of sketched prototypes. So this is like some examples from the project I was talking about earlier, where we went out in the university with some prototypes, and this is what we took with us just some sketches. And these took maybe a day or two for us to put together. They're just on A4 bits of paper, and we took them out. But people can really imagine what they're interacting with. So you have to ask them to use a little bit of imagination, but you do get some great feedback. So I'm a fan of paper prototypes. Not everybody is, because they think that they're perhaps a little too removed from the real product, but I think they're very useful. So the other thing is it's really important to get stuff on the walls. I think it's this idea of an information radiator in Agile kind of translates really well across to user experience. Having somewhere that people in the team can see all the latest designs you're working on, go up and sort of say, oh, what's this thing about over here? And you can have a discussion around that. It's the idea of that, getting that shared understanding of what it is you're trying to build or design. So the next stage is experimentation. And this is really where you've done some designs, you've maybe built some kind of code prototype, and you're going to do an experiment to see if it validates some of your assumptions. And there's a really nice kind of template for this. If you visit luxor.co, this is something that I got from Janice Fraser. It's a really useful thing. So it's basically, at the top it's stating your assumption. We believe that, and then you describe your assumption. We will do or make, so that might be a prototype, it might be code. And then we'll know that this hypothesis is valid because we'll get this kind of signal from our user base. So an example of that is a very simply expressed example. If the call to action button is red, then the number of people registering will go up. So this is a very small thing that you can test. And I think the important thing is when you're going out and validating things that you have to make sure that they're kind of small enough that you can test them. So make sure the thing that you're testing is easy to test. So the stage where you're doing testing, there's some different techniques you can use. One of them we've talked about, which is usability testing. And who has anyone here actually sat in a usability test before? One person, two, three, okay. I would really recommend you try some of these. So basically, if you stay for Jana's talk, you'll hear a lot more about this, but it's really a case of just observing someone using your product, your software, your website, whatever you're building. And you just ask them to do some simple tasks, realistic scenarios that they would do on your website, like, sign up as a new user or purchase something off the website. And you'll be amazed what you learn from watching someone. It's quite scary. But definitely, that's one route. Things like A/B testing, if you've got a large number of people using a website, A/B testing is a great way to understand if one design works better than another. And also things like click tests, analytics, these are all different ways that you can get validation for designs that you're working on. So just to finish off, we've gone through an awful lot. There's a lot to take in there. But my top tips around this kind of approach to designing products is firstly, don't get lazy. And I'm guilty of this. In my most recent project, we did lots and lots of user research right at the beginning, and then we spent several weeks in the office. You've got to make an effort to get out there and keep doing research, keep kind of going and observing people and interviewing them. Really important. Get the whole team to own the user experience of the product. Everybody can be a designer. Everybody can have input to that. It leads to a much better product. And thirdly, don't compromise quality. Remember that the MVP, this minimum viable product, is a kind of perfect slice. It doesn't have to be something that's sort of below par, below, sort of poor quality that you're putting out there. Your customers will notice, and it doesn't look good. So just to summarize, some of the key points: treat your requirements as assumptions. Get out of the building, the whole team, and build a shared understanding of the kind of problems that your customers are having. go through these kind of rapid cycles. So it's about just making sure that you're kind of learning and validating things quicker. So it still might take the same amount of time to develop the product, but you just go through more iterations. So those are my kind of key takeaways from today. I like this quote by Peter Drucker because I think he's a bit of a management guru, but I think this quote kind of sums it up, that efficiency is about doing things right, but effectiveness is doing the right thing. And I think that's kind of what we all have to aim for when we're designing and developing digital products. So that's everything from me. I think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions or so.
There's just two of us making a product right now, and obviously we're on a rather limited budget.
Yep.
One of the things that we decided to do was to try to make something that didn't quite exist yet. And so our first sort of market testing was that we agreed to analyze 100 iPhone apps across 3 markets in one day, and then come back with what people were buying, essentially, and try to make something that was an agglomeration of the 3 or something that was unique. Would you consider that sort of a legitimate form of getting out of a building testing?
I guess that's more of a kind of competitor analysis approach. That is one way that as a user experience person, competitor analysis is something that we do. What I would say is you still really need to get out and see if there's a problem that people have that isn't being solved by these other things. If there's 100 other apps out there that are all doing something, then you'd figure that there's a problem that's already being solved there. Whether people are solving it well or not, how are you going to know that from your kind of just looking at the apps yourself? You might have an idea, but you really need to go out and interview some people.
There are just 2 of us. We're likely to have a rather small sample. What's the sort of like 2 people is a big danger, N of 2, large margin of error. We're not going to get 2,000 people. Where do you see the number in being a good, safe sample?
Qualitative research, if you're doing this continuously, I think as an initial, if you want to go out and get a really, do some interviews and get some really good insights, you could probably go and talk to about 20 people and maybe, talk to them for about an hour each, and you'll get some really good insights from that. As long as you're continually learning more through different routes. But initially, that will give you pretty good sample. Because the thing with qualitative research is, you're not necessarily looking for a huge sample, but you're looking for kind of lots and lots of in-depth insights. And I think that's probably at the start.
If you with 20 people, that seems reasonable.
Yeah, I think as long as you remember that you've got to kind of continuously gather more feedback. So, but at least that would give you a kind of a head start. Thank you, everybody. I will be around this afternoon, so if you have any other questions, do come and have a chat.